All right, folks, thank you all very much for your time today. I've been really looking forward to this, so hopefully you're all going to enjoy this session. As Taras says, I'm James from Company Net. I'm a change and adoption consultant, and I've been involved in dozens of rollouts across many different business sectors over about the last 8 years. So before we start, we're actually going to do a little test survey, because later on in the session, we'll be doing a real one. So what I'd like you to do, please, is just point your mobile phone cameras at this QR code on the screen now, as if you're going to take a picture of it. Don't need to take an actual picture, but most phones will detect this and it'll turn it into a link on your screen that you can click on. So I'm just asking here a really important question. What's your favorite animal? So just give that a try. I'm just going to watch the results as they come in. We're just doing that as a little test now. All right, good popularity already for cats and dogs. Oh, okay, and dogs have shot into, oh my goodness. All right, we're all dog fans apparently. Good bit of unicorn support there from the resident Scots. Good. Okay, so it looks like we've got good usage of that. So we'll use that later on for real, for something a little bit more important than favorite animals. But I'll leave the QR code on the screen for a couple more slides just for people who might want to test that. Okay, so now just a little bit of a disclaimer up front. So Company Net are primarily a Microsoft partner, and a lot of our software solutions and partnerships, they're built around the Microsoft 365 suite of products. But adoption, of course, is not platform dependent. So this knowledge and these practices, they're adaptable to any software, any solution, any toolkit, beyond even the digital world, of course. So I'll mainly be using Microsoft 365 language in this presentation, but it is applicable to a lot of other change scenarios too. So let's begin and let's firstly ask, why should we care about adoption? On the surface, it's a very easy question to answer because we know the goal of adoption. Adoption means that our employees are using the software that we roll out in line with our business needs. So we're getting proper value out of the software that we've already paid for. And I will go through some real life tangible scenarios as I deliver this session, but let's just start with some statistics from large scale studies just to give us a frame of reference. So firstly, in terms of the direct cost, low adoption can render our change ineffective, right? So 70% in one study of large-scale digital change programs, they don't meet the organizers' targets in full. Beyond that, in another study by McKinsey as well, £1.1 trillion of the global investment in digital transformation in 2022 will be wasted because of a failure of adoption, not because of a failure of delivery, a failure of adoption. And then in terms of indirect costs, low adoption can lead to higher effective costs of ownership for software applications, right? Worth up to maybe 30% on top of the existing costs of licenses, implementation and maintenance, staff, and training. 30% on top of just your baseline there. And on the flip side, in the example of high growth tech companies, in the study by Deloitte, comprehensive training can lead to as much as a 218% higher revenue per employee, which is pretty huge. But this is the big one for me as I was looking through these statistics. A 2019 report from Deloitte and Pendo, looking at data from 850 major companies, found that 80% of features in the typical cloud software product are rarely or never used, making £24 billion globally of value left just sitting on the table. It's there to be taken and it's not being picked up. So all of those stats are well and good. Extreme, I was surprised to hear a lot of these myself, but let's just think about some of the more softer impact. Things like the cost of retraining, more support tickets, time spent asking colleagues for help or searching for instructions, procedural mistakes, compliance errors. And of course, there's also the unrealized value where our staff aren't empowered to improve their own business processes. So loads of good reasons to care about this. Now, I'm going to expand on all of this through the session, but I just want to highlight two particular points up front that are worth holding in mind as I go through the rest of the session. And the first point here is that adoption is larger than you might realize, mostly because it's continuous, or at least that it extends further into your project timeline than you might expect. It requires more effort and therefore has a higher impact on your costs, which you'll want to factor up front in your project planning. What I will try to convince you of, though, in this session is of the huge net gain in value of doing adoption right. And I'll also talk about some techniques that you can use to more efficiently run an adoption program to keep those costs down. But for now, let me just do a little work to change our perceptions going in. Instead of thinking about change in terms of the cost of an adoption program, think instead of the cost of failing to adopt our software properly. Then the second point that I'd like to highlight up front, I'll talk about for a little longer than that last one, but this is about the relationship between adoption and IT. And don't worry, this is still an important point to make whether you're an IT person or not. So IT have traditionally had the mammoth task of having to respond to changes in enterprise IT software driven by those software's vendors. Some of these product changes have been slicker, some of them have been far more complex, but every time there's been a change in a product that the user base relies on, IT have had to evaluate those changes against the entire existing digital environment to avoid breaking it. So it's perfectly understandable that IT departments have sometimes been resistant to change what works because there's so much work to do to ensure that new changes don't break other things. And this is especially true of larger organizations with more bespoke software. And also, that interface between IT and our users has become a challenge because if the change is wrong, the service desk can be completely swamped by frustrated users, straining that relationship, and through their frustration, the users can become change resistant too. One of the worst effects of that user frustration can be users taking their needs into what we call shadow IT, which is using third-party software for their business processes in order to get things done, which removes them from your environment, removes them from your control entirely, and it's just a huge risk. But now, though, we exist more and more in the software as a service world. Platforms are more standardized, they're better integrated with each other, so they're now more seamless and they're less liable to break, but they're also less bespoke. So the impact of that change to our software as a service for IT departments has been fairly significant, right? There's less patching, there is less reliance on internal servers, so there's a lot less pain in that area. So a common playing field is great. It means that negative changes are a lot less likely, but that's come with a loss of control. And sometimes there's so many incoming changes that it's difficult to keep on top of what's good and what's risky and what can be ignored. And unfortunately, our users are now very used to software as a service. For example, the constant changes to their iTunes, Spotify, streaming, social media, but they still typically perceive IT as exclusively responsible for the technology changes at work, even though that's not necessarily true anymore. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity, but it does require a culture shift. So this is really the takeaway from point 2 here that I think we should carry forward. And that's that the communication of change with the user base has become more important than ever. It's not about top-down delivery of new software anymore. There's your software, there's your training, go and use it. Now, if you want to reap continuous value, it needs to become a continuous process. So the IT part still needs to happen, but that with all that vital expertise, all that caution about change, but it needs to be augmented and enhanced by a bridging role between IT and the users. So yeah, we've not really even started talking about adoption yet, but this is my first major bit of advice, that the digital world is constantly changing. So thinking of software change as something that's just complete when the product is switched on, or treating software change as just an IT challenge is an out-of-date mindset. You need to hire staff or consult with organizations that can translate between that binary IT world and the softer end user world. Okay, so before I jump across now into the next section, we have the actual survey, the real survey for everyone to participate in. This is just a single question that we'll discuss the results of a little bit later in the session. So just like before, if you can point your phone camera at this QR code as if you're going to take a picture, most phones will have the link to the survey pop up. I'm not going to address them right now, but we'll come to it in a little while. I'll just give a couple of minutes for that. Okay, interesting. And again, I'll just leave that on the next couple of slides, just for those of you that are a little bit behind, but we'll talk about those in a moment. So let's shift gears now and let's get into the meat of this session. So firstly then, let's expand on the definition of adoption from that last section. Most importantly, a lot of people confuse adoption with handover and especially with training. But that is entirely missing the point. What adoption really is the activities that you undertake in order to reach a critical mass of staff within your user base that not only use and gain productive value from your software, your processes, your systems, but that continue to maintain their skills with it. They continue to spread that knowledge amongst your user base. So I'll just highlight the first part of that sentence again. Adoption is the activities that you undertake to reach critical mass of productive usage. Compare that again to training. Yes, training can certainly be a part of that, but it is an extremely limited part. Adoption is about the human. It's about winning hearts and minds. It's about achieving long-term behavioral change, which is the best way to unlock the value that's already sitting on the table in front of you. And especially when we frame that within Microsoft 365, you're already paying for it, but can anyone here truly say that you're getting the maximum productive value out of it? One of the reasons that adoption's become a bit more of a topic of interest recently is that even though many of our companies were somewhere in the middle of our Microsoft 365 journey, that COVID-19 recently forced us to make an emergency shift to remote work, mainly powered by Microsoft Teams. And we didn't have the usual amount of leisurely time to strategize and plan our rollout. So whether or not we're considering this situation in terms of the language of adoption, really we all know that we may not have adopted that suite of programs to the fullest. So in that case, then we need to talk about two main topics that help give us perspective about adoption. Firstly, how people react to it, and secondly, the life cycle. So in terms of the people element, our best frame of reference by far is the diffusion of innovation theory. This is a wonderful tool to help understand adoption, and it's one of the oldest real social science theories, and it still holds up today. This was an attempt to understand how large bodies of people adapt to change, and it actually grew out of studies of farmers in the Midwestern USA in the 1920s. At the time, agricultural technology was advancing rapidly, new seeds, new equipment, new techniques were spreading across the US. But the uptake of those changes was very variable, leading to a really wide range of market share, this axis here, in a given geographical area. And this theory, this still retains a lot of respect today. It's been applied across the human and technical sciences. It's been used in medicine, in marketing, in communications, knowledge management. But fundamentally, here's what this proposes. It says that any given audience of people encountering a change can be broken down into these 5 categories along the left here. Innovators, early adopters, the early majority, the later majority, and the laggards. And we can absolutely, and we should accept that there will always be laggards. There will always be a late majority of people who are slower to adopt a new change for any given reason. And also bear in mind, you could be a laggard in one area, but you could be an early adopter in another. It just depends on the software, depends on your familiarization with it. And it's down to personal preference. But this curve represents all of the people affected by a given change. And it's always similar to this. So what is most useful about thinking about adoption in this way, instead of treating adoption as the completion of some training, some handover package, is that this gives you a more suitable goal, critical mass, like I mentioned earlier. What is the cost of stopping engaging with our user base before we reach critical mass? Well, you don't reach that realization of value. You don't reach that return on investment. The money you've already spent is wasted. And as you can see, the innovators here, the early adopters, they are the tip of the spear. And most importantly, they're not just great because they're naturally eager. They are also a tool that we can use to get the snowball rolling. We should be courting them. We should be maintaining a positive relationship with them because they are one of our core vectors into wider adoption. They help us reach scale. So let's now talk about the life cycle of adoption. There are a number of different change management methodologies out there, but Microsoft internally used ProSize ADKAR model, which CompanyNet are also big fans of, and I hope you'll see why here. ADKAR breaks the journey of adoption down for the individual and for the organization as a whole into 5 different stages. These are awareness of the need to change, desire to support the change, knowledge of how to change, ability to implement the change, and finally reinforcement to sustain the change. And on the surface, those sound straightforward, But there are some really important distinctions here, which are extremely useful perspectives to have when you design your adoption strategy. So firstly, note that we start with awareness. That means communication to the wider business, eventually, yes, but up front, this is communication as well to the project team and sponsors. The people behind the project must understand the value because they'll be communicating it to their colleagues. They'll be generating initial buzz, initial buy-in. Secondly, we have desire. This is so important and a really vital contrast to the traditional IT-led rollout and training. We need our user base to want our changes. We'll talk a little bit more about how we achieve desire later. Next, this key difference between knowledge and ability. Knowledge on its own is, I delivered a 1-hour training session where I covered all the main points. I left the users with a Word document, step-by-step guide with some screenshots. I'm not going to speak to them again. My job is done. My boss is going to tell his boss that the project is complete. This is not good enough on its own. Ability is your users being able to apply that to their real, everyday user journey without any barriers. It is the practical application of what they know, and it's here that we start to derive value. So what does this tell us? It tells us that guidance without relevance is much less valuable. Use real examples, use real scenarios where possible. And then finally, by far the most forgotten part of any rollout is reinforcement. It needs to be more than just those step-by-step guides being available. It needs to be an opportunity for people to ask questions and have them answered by experts, by internal champions, such as our innovators, our early adopters, or ultimately to be supported by each other once we hit that critical mass. This last part, reinforcement, needs to be factored in from the very outset. And why is this true? It's true because people forget things over time, and they forget more sharply the first time than the second, third, fourth times that they learn something. The more that we keep our employees engaged with our software and our training, the more we keep their mind in this space, the more that they will retain what they've learned for longer. There's obvious value here. And before I leave ADKAR, I just want to return to our D, our desire. Desire is something that you need to be thinking about and generating throughout the entire process. And for me, at least, I see so many rollouts that begin with an uphill struggle because our user base is already so tired of frequent change, of the usual fire and forget rollout cycle where they don't feel fully supported. That even when you begin your rollout of new software, your user base are already resistant. You're firing your start gun for a load of people who don't even want to run the race. So from the outset and throughout the process, you need to be generating trust in what you're doing. You need to be showing the audience how this process differs from those that they might already be tired of. You need to be selling the changes with real examples of improvements to daily working processes and targeting pain points that you know the audience legitimately has. And as much as possible, you need to let the users that you're engaging with feel genuinely supported and give them a human face to connect to. And I do mean that last point very literally. So here's another useful tip. It can be helpful to almost make a brand for your engagement as either an individual or say the X project team or whatever it needs to be, who can humanize your engagement. For example, a personal example here, in a lot of my longer term adoption projects, I try to actively brand them as from James at Company Net. This isn't about ego, it's about acting as a specific identifiable brand that is independent from the audience's existing prejudices against the forces of change that they might already be familiar with. You can do this with a project team name, but if your brand, individual or collective, can start generating trust, that will help produce desire, which will help generate momentum, which will help you reach critical mass. And hopefully what I've just told you there stands out against what you might have expected to hear in this session. Compared to a traditional rollout that ends at training and go live, I've just covered something that is far softer than you might have been thinking about. But this is really, really important. We're trying to win humans, not turn on software. Always be thinking about how you win people, individuals, humans to your side. And the great thing about ADKAR, one of the reasons we love this, is that it helps do this for us. It takes that soft art form of change and it turns it into a nice binary digital world for techies. It helps codify the interactions with humans into a step-by-step thought process, uses a common language, so it helps you bridge that divide. Okay, let's change gears a little bit again and think instead about how we design an adoption strategy. Now, a traditional project process is perfectly viable. You prepare, create your action group, plan your approach, engage your user base, roll out, conduct launch activities, have a period of monitoring uptake, and then you'll transition into BAU. And that is probably pretty representative of the way that you would budget for it as well. But let's talk about some of the differences that you might see and some of the sensible thought processes along the way. So firstly, it is worth recognizing that we might not necessarily be starting from scratch. So Taras has shared with me the results of our poll, so let's look at that now. Okay, all right, well, this is very interesting, and I think agrees with a lot of what I've been saying. So we had 25% of you there say that you are well established, which is good. Nobody said maximum utilization, but quite a lot of you feeling well established, 25%. Some of you finding your feet, but 63% of you said that you were still just during rollout, right? So we're still rolling out right now. And I wonder, we maybe could have asked how long you feel like you've been rolling out for, because I bet that isn't that you've recently started doing it in the last couple of weeks. So, you know, a lot of us just feel like we're still within this process. We're still on the path of getting our value out of Office 365. So whatever your answer was there, it's worth still doing your planning for adoption, potentially from scratch. And this is worth doing still, perhaps, because we're planning on grabbing that free value that is sitting on the table in front of us. But in all of those cases where you're partway through the journey, you have resources already that you can use in your adoption strategy. The first one of these is user sentiment. You can use this to identify pain points and selling points of your current state. And the second thing here is people, whether these are your always optimistic innovators and early adopters, or whether they're your frustrated majorities who become eager to make the change when they see the potential of your new approach. Both of these are potentially valuable user groups because they both have a good story, and it's often a narrative that matters in winning hearts and minds. And whether or not you are starting from scratch, you still need to be honest with yourselves about your business culture and factor that into your engagement. Is your user base eager or change averse, or are they entrenched? Are they frustrated, and can you use that frustration to make this rollout distinct? Are your users inspired to change by managers or champions, or are they generally self-service? You've got to build your comms, you've got to build your strategy around knowing that. Next up, as another thing to think about here, we have the composition of our action group, our project team, and hopefully I've already made this clear that it shouldn't be just an IT-led initiative. IT have a very important seat at the table, but your action group should absolutely include the people that can bridge the gap, not just trainers, but people who speak the user base's language. And that applies in both directions, not just your internal comms team, but representatives of the user base as well, perhaps your digital champions if you have those. It is also important to think not just about the way that you create desire in the user base, but also about how you create desire from your senior stakeholders. And these are two very different tasks. Senior stakeholders are the key holders of our project, for one, but they're also the people whose voices carry the most weight. And winning over the senior folk can start a great cascade of top-down momentum that you can leverage. So you do want to get them on board early, and the same applies to our managers, our team leads, and so on. So show these people some love. If they're available and you have the potential to make their lives easier, let them be a pilot. Give them a bit of white glove service. And even though working at that level can sometimes be frustrating, they are still a huge value win. Even if you don't pilot to them, it's always worth keeping your managers in the loop and broadly accepting of all of the changes that you're intending to make. I recently conducted a survey for a customer across some users that we deemed to have successfully adopted a change the way that we wanted. So we had a group of people that were doing things how we thought that they should be. And when we asked them how they, what they credited with their success, 55% of them credited manager input and team coordination as the reason. 55%. The others, the lower numbers there, were messaging, support, training, availability of resources. All of those were less than having the manager drive a coordinated effort. We will talk a little bit more about how to win over the user base in a moment, but let me just now skip right to the end of the project lifecycle, and we'll talk about that last element, transition to BAU. So a lot of you might have let this slide when I said it before, just without batting an eyelid. But the most attentive of you might have noticed that transition to BAU doesn't fit right with what I was saying earlier about our ADKAR model and how that last R is reinforcement. Too often, transition to BAU means that the project is done, that the IT support team can handle any technical issues and the users have the right user guides if they need them. But that is not reinforcement. And if we haven't yet reached critical mass when we finish our project, then the user base's skill risks diminishing. Reinforcement is about keeping our users engaged and supported and trusting. And with this recent shift from off-the-shelf products to software as a service, we have the perfect opportunity for that. We now live in a world where our software improves and evolves over time to much shorter timescales than before. So this idea might still feel a little bit scary. There's certainly a few people for whom the idea of constant change is going to be a daunting prospect. But presented right, constant change can also be seen as an opportunity to find new tools, to find new methods with which to improve our productivity and our daily workload. And we can sell our users on the value of that. And just talking of users, it is important to recognize that our employees want to be productive. They want solutions. They don't want complications and frustrations. If you're telling employees that we're making a change because it's what the company wants or needs, your messaging is wrong, or at the very least, it's incomplete. Our users, the humans that we're courting, they care about their own productivity. They care about the ease of their daily tasks, social interaction, environmental concerns. And a lot of that can tie into the tools that we hand them and make great selling points in your comms. So as a side note there, I recently delivered a session on Teams adoption from the perspective of minimizing a carbon footprint. Because the correct use of Teams, it can minimize emails, and emails have a far higher environmental impact. And this was one of my most attended sessions ever because the user base cared about that topic. So now they care about adopting Teams. So anyway, the energy, the effort, the cost have to carry your project to the critical mass tipping point, and it's only then that you have built a bank of experts internally who take the role of champions, they take the role of sharing the information, and at that point it becomes intuitive, it becomes accessible to your user base, and that's where you get that value realization. So really this is what I'm saying here is that there is an investment requirement here. In the new digital world of constant change, what Microsoft calls the evergreen world, it is important to have people committed to analyzing, distilling, prioritizing, implementing, communicating this constant change. And sometimes those changes are more of an FYI, sometimes they require more strategic response to preserve business processes, sometimes they're going to be new functionality that the user base is going to get good value out of. And if it's not viable to have somebody pick up that large responsibility internally, a lot of companies advise on exactly that, just as CompanyNet do for our customers with our own evergreen service. So that leads us into the last section for today then, where I've picked out a few of my favorite strategies and some tools that I think are particularly useful. I will start with one that follows on from what we've just been talking about, and that's constant updates, constant improvement. So while these evergreen services are typically targeted at your strategic teams, that last point about attractive, useful, new content of real value to the users, this makes a great example of something that you can publish continually as small, digestible, frequent updates across your user base. The best example of this that I've seen is posting bite-sized little updates like this, along with hints and tips in dedicated social channels like Yammer, which you can also use for support. So then users are encouraged to visit a social support space by these attractive morsels of new features and new tips and tricks. They're all attracted in, so then the community grows, it stays active, and user-on-user support can help gain momentum towards critical mass. And the great thing about that is you don't need to have any additional resourcing from your end, right? You encourage the snowball to grow for itself, much lower cost. The next strategy here is about making content that people can digest. Excuse me. The majority of people would prefer to watch a 5-minute video over reading a document that takes 5 minutes to read. If you can create short, to the point, clear guidance videos, the user base will lap them up. Any content that you create should be able to be broken down into smaller chunks. Firstly, why it matters. Secondly, what you need to do. Thirdly, how to do it. So maybe that's the 3 introductory videos right there. And this approach of making everything bite-sized, this is really useful because different users have different mental approaches. Some people just want to have the core basics and get on with it. So you just make the simple stuff the most prominent. But some people want to understand everything. They've got a big appetite for this stuff. So you make explainer videos, you make the more advanced topics a separate thing. So they're only there for the people that actually care about them. And there are even more advantages of doing it this way. Bite size means that you can spread out your training across a longer time frame. You can reinforce your engagement with the change whilst building up a knowledge base of users. It also gives you great small updates for your social channels, so you can build internal networks of champions, of support. And then finally, on this last point, these little easy introduction videos, they might build your project's brand. They might build trust enough that the people who might otherwise just stick to the basics now have the desire to learn more and expand their skills. This is just a win-win-win-win-win. The final strategy that I'll talk about today, which comes right about around the rollout phase. This is something that I really like, and I call it the feedback funnel. This combines a number of approaches, essentially as a cost-saving exercise to help your message reach the most users while requiring the least support on your end. You'll run your pilots, you'll run your initial activities, you'll take your lessons learned from all of that, and you'll use that to prepare your static comms. Make yourself reference documents, of course, such as user guides, explainers, the things that apply to everybody. And you'll sit those files somewhere that everybody can access, but that you can still edit them without needing to reissue them. So now your supporting documentation is living documentation. And you'll then try and break down the user base by challenge level. You can do this by things like a sentiment analysis, so you can try and understand the resistances that people already have, or you could do this by technical difficulty of the change by different groups, or you could use some combination of those, give some kind of challenge ranking. But either way, you work out how hard you think the shift for each group is going to become. And then you target your rollout in those tranches. So you would start with the hardest group, those who you need to give the most actual direct support to, the most handholding. But what this lets you do is it lets you revise your supporting documents. It lets you spot more universal messaging that you might need to convey. It allows you to refine your strategy. Once that ball is rolling, you can send comms out to the medium difficulty group, who you now hopefully have clear, tried and tested messaging for, and who can be supported by your champions and by your internal support. And then finally, once that's kind of validated your assumptions about all of your messaging, you can send out the blanket comms to the bulk of the user base, those that you think will be easiest. So now you have all 3 groups progressing in parallel. And of course, you can shift groups up or down based on what more you discover when you're engaging actually with them. But the important thing here is you supplement all of this with the way that you manage feedback and the need for support. So via the messaging in your comms, you imply to everybody that there is only a single source of truth, your static guidance. You point people there first. But then within those documents, you put in the links or direction to your enhanced support, perhaps from a Yammer group or a team of internal experts like your champions. And it's then through monitoring those support channels that you then triage the more complex support needs into direct hands-on contact. But each time you do this, each time you solve a tougher problem, you can add that in to your universal guidance. So you are shrinking the need for expert support as you grow the strength of your living documentation. Let me just find my place in my notes. Oh yeah, so I love this for 3 reasons. Firstly, the expert effort is able to be focused on the areas of real challenge, which gets smaller over time. Secondly, the incoming challenges refine, they improve your own guidance, so they make them better equipped to handle the bulk of cases. And then thirdly, doing this empowers your intermediate support mechanism, your Yammer group, your digital champions, whoever it needs to be. These people internally to your organization can improve their own skills. They can become the agent of momentum that you need them to be. Okay, that is probably enough to think about for one session. So thank you very much for sticking with me. There's loads more that I could have said, loads more good engagement techniques, loads on managing resistance, measures of success, lots of things that we could talk about there. But we do have to keep this to a sensible timing, and we have to leave room for questions. So let me hand back now to Taras so that we do have some time for our questions. Thank you all very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, James. I apologize if anybody can hear a helicopter that's just turned up outside my window in perfect timing for when I was going to come back on here, but there you go. So yeah, before we look at any questions that have come in, I'd just like to thank you all for attending this morning. We're really keen to carry on the conversation around Microsoft 365 and user adoption with you. Appreciate we've got a mix today of existing CompanyNet customers and people perhaps we haven't worked with before, and you'll be in very different points in your Microsoft 365 journey, as I think we identified in that survey. Either way, CompanyNet has the means to help you and your people get more out of Microsoft 365. So if you're interested in having a chat about how we can provide something a bit more tailored to your needs, do get in touch with us. The address is on the screen there. Thank you, James. Company-net.com.